Yesterday, the Canadian Prime Minister stood on the shore of Lake Ontario at the National Water Research Institute in Burlington and signed the Canadian Sovereign Water Resource Extraction Act into law. That single signature did not just finalize a domestic environmental policy. It immediately wiped $270 billion in market capitalization from the global consumer beverage sector in less than a week. The weapon used was not a conventional tariff or an international sanction, but a surgical exercise of domestic resource sovereignty that has left multinational corporate legal department is completely paralyzed. This specific legislative maneuver follows a century of settled international law regarding resource authority. Yet its application to freshwater on an industrial scale represents an absolute departure from global trade norms. Bilateral frameworks like the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement explicitly exclude water in its natural state from trade provisions, and the World Trade Organization maintains zero jurisdiction over domestic resource taxation. That precise statutory gap is why corporate legal teams had no early warning mechanisms or regulatory countermeasures prepared. When the legislation cleared the Canadian Parliament with unified support from every major political party, it bypassed the traditional channels of foreign corporate lobbying entirely. What began as a routine bilateral dispute over dairy quotas and timber pricing has consequently transformed into a fundamental repricing of the most basic input in global consumer manufacturing. The structural vulnerability exposed by this act lies within the Tier 3 extraction threshold, which applies a per-liter charge directly to commercial operations withdrawing freshwater for the purpose of commercial sale, either as the final product or as the primary ingredient by volume. That statutory phrasing targets the exact margin architecture of multinational beverage giants, where water consistently constitutes between 90% and 94% of the finished product by volume. Historically, operations calculated this input at a cost baseline of effectively zero, allowing companies like Coca-Cola to sustain an exceptional 60% gross margin by pricing only aluminum packaging, logistics, and marketing. The implementation of the Canadian tax shifts that input from a negligible variable to a material cost, translating to an immediate increase of 7 to 12 cents per retail unit. That compression compounds through every subsequent layer of the distribution and bottling network, fundamentally shifting the global gravity of beverage manufacturing economics. The resulting stock market reaction was highly asymmetrical, driving a 15% collapse in PepsiCo stock within 48 hours compared to an 11% decline for Coca-Cola. That differential reveals specific structural exposures that capital markets had never previously quantified. Notably that PepsiCo's Canadian bottling network comprises a significantly larger proportion of its total global revenue matrix. Furthermore, the cost impact extends deep into PepsiCo's Frito-Lay infrastructure, which relies on high-volume water extraction for industrial processing, compounding the margin pressure across non-beverage categories. Because the broader snack and food processing divisions operate on thinner baseline margins than pure beverage assets, the identical resource tax produced a much sharper percentage reduction in blended profitability. That variance accelerated institutional selling pressure, concentrating risk metrics on the corporation with the highest exposure to Canadian domestic infrastructure. The strategic anxiety gripping global markets, however, is not driven by the direct operational costs within Canadian borders, but by the legal precedent this legislation establishes for every water-rich nation on Earth. If a stable rule-of-law G7 democracy can successfully implement a sovereign resource extraction tax on water, the legal template immediately becomes available to jurisdictions holding the planet's primary freshwater reserves. Brazil's Environment Ministry has already announced an immediate administrative review of commercial extraction frameworks within the Amazon basin, while Indonesia's Trade Ministry issued a parallel statement affirming absolute sovereign authority over national hydrological assets. That immediate policy cascade indicates that institutional investors are no longer pricing a localized trade disruption, but rather the permanent end of the global assumption that freshwater remains a free corporate input at the point of origin. The diplomatic response from Washington confirms that the executive branch has encountered a complete sovereignty trap with no viable avenue for economic retaliation. The administration's public threats of broad trade countermeasures remain entirely unspecified, because any formal challenge to Canada's right to tax its internal natural resources would legally compromise the domestic resource taxation frameworks of individual American states. Challenging the principle of sovereign resource extraction authority would directly undermine the legal mechanisms that allow states like Texas to tax oil production or Alaska to levy mineral extraction fees. The United States Trade Representatives claim that the tax is inherently discriminatory was dismantled within hours by legal experts who noted the statute applies uniformly to all commercial extractors regardless of national origin. That domestic legal gridlock ensures that the federal government cannot shield domestic corporations without severely damaging its own internal revenue architecture. The corporate strategy to contain the narrative has shifted from public denial to internal risk remodeling, as evidenced by PepsiCo's recent emergency investor call, where financial officers acknowledged the industry had never historically modeled sovereign resource taxation at this scale. That admission matches the broader market assessment delivered by Berkshire Hathaway, which holds a 9.2% stake in Coca-Cola, valued across 38 years as a permanent asset. The public analysis coming out of Omaha explicitly compared this transition to the 1973 oil crisis, noting that just as global industrial infrastructure permanently restructured when producing nations exercise sovereign authority over petroleum pricing, the consumer economy is entering a parallel decade-long adjustment period for water, because water possesses zero industrial alternatives or synthetic substitutes. The long-term capital reallocation will hit agriculture and heavy manufacturing with even greater structural force than the beverage sector. But the more consequential question, the one that national security councils and sovereign wealth funds are calculating with intense strategic scrutiny, was still unanswered. While the escalating legal gridlock, localized operational adjustments, and political stalemates across North America demonstrate the immediate multi-layered friction of this policy, the overarching geopolitical calculus points to a much deeper structural transformation. The immediate tactical shock to corporate balance sheets is merely the surface manifestation of a profound reallocation of resource power. This shift fundamentally alters the relationship between sovereign nations holding primary ecological assets and the multinational entities that have historically assumed unfettered access to them. The collision of sovereign law, economic necessity, and corporate margin structures means that the global landscape has permanently fractured along resource lines. For Canada, this strategy yields an immediate dual advantage, establishing both a highly lucrative domestic revenue stream and an entirely new instrument of geopolitical leverage. By anchoring the legislation within undisputed international legal norms, Ottawa has successfully dictated terms to its largest trading partner without violating international trade treaties or triggering actionable retaliatory measures. This move effectively positions Ottawa as the primary architect of modern resource nationalism, proving that middle powers can successfully reprice critical assets if their legal framing is airtight. The long-term full implication for the Canadian state is a significant expansion of its fiscal autonomy and a strengthened domestic mandate over environmental stewardship, insulated entirely from foreign corporate interference. For the United States, the outcome is a stark realization of domestic vulnerability and a severe limitation of imperial economic power. The federal government faces a permanent degradation of its ability to shield its most iconic consumer brands from external regulatory shocks when those shocks are executed via internal taxation rather than external tariffs. Washington is forced to accept a reality where its internal legal consistency prevents it from projecting power outward to protect corporate interests. This dynamic will inevitably accelerate deep fractures within the domestic political landscape, forcing a structural reassessment of how American manufacturing centers must pivot away from a reliance on external, unpriced inputs toward heavily subsidized domestic water retention technologies. For Europe, This precedent serves as an immediate catalyst for the harmonization of its own fragmented water management frameworks. The European Parliament's rapid move towards standardized extraction accountability models indicates that the continent will use the Canadian template to address its own internal localized water scarcities and corporate extraction anxieties. This shift will likely materialize as a comprehensive continent-wide environmental levy, blending resource nationalism with the European Union's existing aggressive climate and resource tracking mandates. The consequence for corporations operating within the European single market will be an accelerated, non-negotiable compliance regime that treats water with the same rigorous fiscal scrutiny currently applied to carbon emissions. For major developing economies like India and Brazil, the Canadian precedent offers a powerful, legally validated mechanism to reclaim economic rents from foreign capital. New Delhi and Brasilia are presented with a flawless blueprint to monetize their vast, under-regulated natural assets to stabilize domestic budgets under the banner of national sovereignty and resource equity. In highly populated or ecologically stressed regions, this model will be deployed not just as a fiscal tool, but as a critical mechanism of national security to prevent domestic aquifers from being depleted for foreign export markets. This paradigm shift ensures that foreign direct investment in the global south will increasingly require strict, per-unit resource extraction fees, permanently raising the cost baseline for multinational manufacturing hubs. The global beverage industry, alongside high-volume agricultural and industrial processors, faces an immediate mandate to execute a brutal, structural reorganization. The historical business model, which treated the primary physical ingredient of its products as a free input rounding to zero in margin equations, is obsolete. Corporate strategy must now pivot away from marketing-driven brand valuation and toward aggressive, capital-intensive sourcing diversification and localized desalination projects. The highly optimized, centralized bottling plants that once maximized global distribution efficiency will give way to fragmented, less efficient localized networks designed explicitly to mitigate the tax exposure of any single sovereign jurisdiction. Ultimately, the singular takeaway from this global market rupture is that the era of treating primary ecological assets as invisible, unpriced inputs for private wealth generation has reached its definitive end. The real story is not a localized trade dispute or a temporary corporate margin squeeze, but the formalized awakening of sovereign resource ownership over the planet's most critical liquid asset. When the legal architecture of a G7 nation explicitly establishes that a public necessity cannot be transformed into private capital for free, the baseline assumption of global commodity pricing shifts permanently. The global economy has officially entered an era where geography dictates profitability, and where the foundational inputs of industrial civilization will be priced by the states that hold them, rather than the corporations that extract them. The corporate moat, no matter how deep or historically secure, cannot survive the pricing of the foundation beneath it.